Folks, this is John Carroll. I'm the editor of EndPoint's News and your host today for our Zoom webinar on the FDA and the regulatory landscape during the pandemic. It's a huge issue for everybody that's involved in this. We've been seeing an impact on clinical trials, issues related to trial sites closing, a natural reluctance to go anywhere near a hospital, and a host of related issues as the pandemic wave crested and receded in China, hit Europe, spread to the United States, and then to the rest of the world. There's a lot to cover today, and we have just the panel to do it. But first, I'd like to introduce today's webinar sponsor, Alok Tai with Ignite. Alok, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, John, and the team at EndPoints for the opportunity to present and sponsor this webinar today. I'd like to just tell you a little bit about Ignite and what we do in advance of kicking off the discussion. So, as John mentioned, my name is Alok Tai. I'm the VP of Life Sciences here at Ignite, and my responsibility is for the Life Sciences industry segment at Ignite. And so essentially what Ignite does is we provide a secure content platform specifically focused on key global industries. In the context of our work with the life sciences industry, we serve 400 to 500 life science customers with 50,000 plus users who are supported by 600 employees globally across multiple offices. And essentially what we do is we help companies manage and govern regulated and mission critical data, whether it be files and folders, to meet compliance requirements like Part 11 and GXP, but also facilitate data governance and data privacy as well. And so many of our customers who start with us in the life sciences industry at the inception of their company often use us for back office and R&D data. However, as their programs and projects evolve, start to see a new set of challenges they would love help with, whether it be in the clinical development area with trial master files, handling document management for submissions, or quality and manufacturing type data as well across their distributed network. Ignite as a company has a unique platform that we call Ignite for Life Sciences that helps facilitate all of this. And so this platform, which is focused for the life sciences industry, has three key components that we call the 3 C's. The first C is compliance, to help companies meet GXP and Part 11 type requirements to manage documents and data appropriately. The second C is for connectivity, to facilitate the flow of data from your CROs or different systems of record in your environment into your own repository. And the last C is capabilities, to help support the pipelining of data to different types of environments, as well as facilitating data protection in the context of data governance and data security. So, we really take a tremendous amount of pride in supporting the life sciences industry and the proud mission that each of you and your companies pursue, and are keen to hopefully partner with you and speak with you about how we can help support your drug discovery and medical device activities in the future. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks Alok. I appreciate you standing in with us today. Now I'd like to introduce today's panel. First off, we have Roy Baines, the head of Global Clinical Development and Chief Medical Officer at Merck. Samit Hirawat, the Chief Medical Officer and Head of Development for Bristol Myers Squibb. Lisa O'Dowd, the Global Regulatory Affairs Head of Immunology, Regulatory Policy and Intelligence for Janssen. Jeremy Chadwick, SVP and Head of the Global Development Office at Takeda. And Peter Pitts, ex-FDA Associate Commissioner and President of the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest, and as I just learned, a special government employee in SGE, which we'll find out a little bit more of maybe in just a little while. But Roy, I want to start this conversation with you. I think I'd like to get a picture of what happened at Merck. You have a huge pipeline. The pandemic hit, and what did you do, and how did you go about deciding how to do it?
Well, thanks, John. I'm going to talk just from the clinical development and clinical trials perspective. Obviously, there's a whole other story around manufacturing and field-facing activities. The pandemic, as you know, started in China. All countries and all regions at a large company such as Merck have business continuity plans. And the China epidemic began, and we deployed our business continuity plans and obviously had to adapt as we went. I think it's important to recognize that we have a remarkable degree of control over our operations because of an operating decision we made several years ago, We moved away completely from the contract research organization model, and it pretty much internalized everything. So we have a high degree of control over operations, data, analysis, etc. We're also a global company operating in more than 60 different countries. And obviously, we had to be mindful of the continuity plans across the world. So in China, very rapidly, the Chinese government moved to a work from home policy. And, we were able to deploy our business continuity plan. Obviously, we had to change things dramatically. We couldn't get on site. We couldn't necessarily interact directly with physicians or patients. And so we deployed a number of modalities to ensure continuity. It became very apparent early on that there would need to be a lot of adjustments to maintain site continuity, site activity, drug supply, patient assessment, data flows. And we were able to really have a very good dress rehearsal in China. We watched the pandemic move, and interestingly, FDA and EMA were very proactive in coming out with guidelines, which really were quite permissive and enabled quite a degree of latitude to adapt operations. We learned from our China experience and were able to adapt that globally. And it became very clear to us early on that we did not want to get into the business of blanket statements about shutdowns or pauses or delays. And we made a conscious decision. The mantra was, we're open for business and no patient will be left behind. And the vignette that I will share with you from China, I think, speaks to that. We were shut down completely for 8 weeks. For example, on our oncology trials in China, of which there are a great number, not a single patient was lost to follow-up. Certain patients missed doses. Everyone is back on schedule. And we've been able to pretty much not miss a beat in China. And that was recapitulated around Asia Pacific and then essentially around the world. We do recognize that local conditions will dictate a little bit, or to some extent, how the operational world looks. But at the end of the day, we have not had to do any blanket statements. We've developed a large number of internal guidances consistent with the regulatory guidances, which have allowed for workarounds around disruptions. Many of these relate to alternate sites, alternate drug supply, remote monitoring, site activation, site startup, investigator meetings, and I could go on, but we've a whole code related to the workarounds. Very important to document everything that you've done. And, the good news is that this business continuity plan and its adaptations have enabled us to really not miss a beat. And, just the metrics, we have not missed any data locks this year. We have not missed any planned filings. And essentially the programs are on track.
So I'd like to get everybody else involved in this conversation at this point, looking towards the FDA in terms of what was necessary, what needed to happen, and how fast it needed to happen. What were the key things that the FDA had to change in order to facilitate developers to continue to go, and how forthcoming was this in terms of seeing this happen? Samit, maybe we could pick up from Bristol Myers' perspective here.
Sure. Thank you, John. And thanks, Roy, for providing the perspective from your side of things and the way you looked at it. So I'll give you two things. One, when the pandemic hit and the action we took, and very quickly then how we collaborated from the guidances that were provided by FDA and other agencies, also from Europe, the guidance came across. So the paramount thing over here was to ensure the safety of the patients, of course, which is exactly what the guidance also stated, that no matter what, the patient's safety should certainly be kept up front. And second was the safety of the employees, because they have to go out to the field in terms of data monitoring, as well as meeting with the sites to ensure the source data verifications are occurring, et cetera. So we had to take action on that. As Roy also mentioned, missing data becomes a big issue, and how to manage that workload, ensuring that you're still conducting clinical trials, because pandemic or no pandemic, other diseases still there, and we have to continue to do the research in that area. And I do have to say that we had to take a conscious decision to not do anything in terms of blanket statements or anything for most of the therapeutic areas, but we did take a pause on the cell therapy trials because we were very conscious that at the time when the pandemic was going towards its peak in many places, the infrastructure was required to manage patients who were being infected with COVID. ICU beds were getting filled. And with cell therapies, we know that one of the side effects could be the cytokine release syndrome, for example, or neurological toxicity, which may require a patient to be admitted to the ICU. So we wanted to be very careful on that aspect. And so we took a short pause in those. And as the situation is continued to evolve and change in many of the countries, we were able to restart, and we're happy to report that we are able to provide that treatment now to patients again in most places wherever we can conduct clinical.
So how long was that pause for? I'm curious about that.
I think it was about a month and a half. It didn't last very long because, as Roy was also mentioning, things started in the east, but slowly they started going towards the west. So we were able to follow that trajectory and start to reinitiate sites and start to continue work with the sites as they began to come out of that heavy load and heavy burden imposed on them by the terrible aspects of COVID and the patients requiring the ventilation, et cetera. So we are in a good place now, and we are really seeing a good trajectory in terms of patients being able to receive the therapy. Now, from the FDA perspective, we work very closely with them on various aspects. As you know, there are a multitude of therapeutic areas we are obviously working in. From oncology side, things are, I think, FDA has had always a visionary way of thinking, and they had things in place through real-time oncology review, for example, working with other countries through the Orbis initiative that they have as well. So I think they didn't really miss a beat and continued on. On the other hand, I think the biologics division had a much higher workload because many therapies then start to investigate either approved treatments or new treatments in those patient populations, which are biologics. So the workload certainly increased. And I think we're still continuing that dialogue with the FDA to ensure that while vaccines are being developed, while biologics are being developed, how will they be able to provide that continuous oversight as well as guidance to development of other therapies for other diseases, and in all areas, not just the therapeutics development, but also manufacturing and also for guidances of how to utilize the data from real world and so on and so forth. So a lot of work ongoing, a lot of good connection with the FDA. I do have to say they didn't miss a beat. When the meeting was required, we did get a meeting. We were able to get email exchange going. There are many things that we will talk later on, maybe of what else can be done in terms of improving that communication as well as guidances that we can get. But I do have to say that they've done a wonderful and marvelous job in keeping us on track.
Definitely, we'll get back to that. Lisa, I am curious from your perspective, what was the most important thing that you needed to find out from the FDA at the beginning of this process, and how did that play out? I think you're on mute, Lisa. There you go.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can.
Yeah, great. I think the most important thing was really the ability to implement quickly implementable changes to protect patient safety. That was front and foremost. So we talked a little bit around the need to protect the patients in the trial. It was just as important to understand what to do for those patients who require and depend upon continuation of study drug in order to be able to survive, and particularly in the case of oncology programs and programs such as that. So for us, it was the, can we be pragmatic? Can we be flexible? Can we implement changes quickly? Do we have to wait for approvals? Or can we just go? I think the other point, just to highlight and build on some of the other comments made, was that the FDA has been very flexible and adaptive. As we go, as we iterate, as we live together through this crisis, we have seen updates to the guidance. They're addressing our questions. They're updating it to make sure it's concurrent with what our needs are as we have maturity through the life cycle of these programs impacted by COVID. We haven't touched on this yet, but I think the other point to highlight is, as vaccine developers and companies working on therapeutics against the COVID virus, it's been important that we've had a way to interact with the agency on the development of those modalities. So certainly CBER and CDER respectively have shown flexibility in working with sponsors who are trying to develop these measures and interacting with us as needed to make sure that we're moving forward and trying to get timely trials out to understand how we could develop therapeutics and vaccines against COVID.
I'm just going to interrupt for just a second, just to tell the audience, there's a place on your screen for you to, if you've got a question for the panel as a whole or any individual on the panel, there's a place that you can submit these questions. We'll be reviewing the questions as we go through the conversation, and we'll select a few here towards the end where we can get some questions in from the audience. And if you have them, if you'd like them directed to any individual on the panel, please just let us know which one, and we'll make sure that we do that. So if you go ahead and start on that process, as they come to you, it's best to go ahead and get them in so we can begin to look over the queue of questions that we're going to have. So Jeremy, I am curious, I mean, from your perspective, I mean, were there certain aspects of communications from the FDA that were most critical towards continuing operations, and what were they?
So it's a great question, John, and I think that the comments made to date by the panelists are really spot on. And I think, that some of the differences between what Roy, Elisa, and Sumit talked about reflect, the differences in therapeutic areas, the differences in approaches. I think from my perspective, I think the FDA has done an outstanding job, not just on the on the vaccine, the treatment of COVID, but in keeping pretty much everything going across all the therapeutic areas. I think, they've been very responsive throughout. Clearly, that's something you hear from the other panel members. I think focusing specifically on COVID treatment, I mean, some of the turnaround times and the availability of the FDA has just been remarkable, just incredibly fast response times that we've never as an industry or regulators been able to achieve before. That is incredibly impressive and just goes to show what can be done. It kind of raises questions and opportunities, and I think Sumit was probably hinting at that, John, about, and we'll talk later, I'm sure, in the session, about what we need to do going forward and opportunities to do that. But I think the fast turnaround, the flexibility, the realization that this is a special time, these are all characteristics which we saw constantly in Takeda and from other colleagues and other companies.
So Peter, let's get you involved in this conversation as well. You've had a chance to observe the FDA from the inside in terms of how it's communicating with companies, how it's communicating with the public as a whole. Obviously, the FDA had a particular kind of a job to do as it relates to, continuing R&D so that things didn't collapse. There's very little about R&D that doesn't involve the FDA in one fashion or another. So from your own perspective, I mean, how did you think this played out? And what were the most important things that the FDA needed to do in order to keep the shop open?
Well, I think, I'll agree with the panel. The FDA gets a big gold star for what it's done. I think that, one issue that hasn't been raised is quality. Safety, clearly, but you don't have safety without quality. And I think the ability to bounce back relative to things like inspections, for example, has been spectacular. I think there are a lot of lessons that have been learned that can be applied post-COVID to many other things. Hopefully people don't choose to kind of look backwards, but rather go forwards. I think clearly, the ability to work from home at FDA is not a new thing. So I'm glad the FDA had a jump start on that. But also the whole aspect of collegiality of the agency, not just as regulator, but also as partner. And I think that's true not just for COVID vaccines and therapeutics, but for all issues relative to development and manufacturing. I think that, the flexibility, as Lisa has brought up, has been key, and everything is different. There's no cookie cutter approach here. If you're dealing with a orphan disease program, your clinical trials have been impacted one way. If you're dealing with a cardiovascular product, it's been something else entirely. And I think that divisions have been very good at developing their own ways of being flexible and keeping things moving forward. So I think the collegiality aspect here hasn't been talked about a lot, but I think as the history of this is written, that's going to be a key part of it.
Interesting perspective here. So in other words, the relationship that exists between the regulators and the individuals in the industry that are doing the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And that includes academia as well, as we kind of segue the conversation into kind of warp speed issues. But but COVID aside, I think that it's been remarkable that obviously things are slowing down, but they've been kept on a forward motion dynamic, which is really quite impressive, and has not been emulated, for example, in Europe.
Well, this gets to another point. I mean, it seems like sometimes it seems to me as if the pandemic has been going on for well over a year, and of course it's been 6 months. And you wonder whether there is, at some point a certain level of COVID fatigue enters into this sort of thing. I think there was an initial rush of adrenaline in a lot of different respects, which is a good thing. A lot of people had to do a lot of work very early on. I was talking to a couple of people in senior R&D positions a couple months into it, and they were talking about how they were able to work more at home. And I think a lot of people found that they could be very productive doing this kind of work at home. But do you see, a certain level of COVID fatigue settling in at the agency? I mean, can you sustain that level of response?
No, I see, in fact, I see the opposite. I see acceleration. I think that the lessons learned from, for example, Vioxx and Avandia formed calluses on the FDA's hands. They understand now that when they get beat up in the press and accused of being overly political, they can kind of shift in their seats a little bit and get back to work. I think that in earlier times, the issues that followed, things like hydroxychloroquine and convalescent plasma, could have shut the agency down. And it didn't. I think that people at the agency recognized that a lot of the arrows and darts that were being thrown at them were not relevant, untrue, unfair. And rather than throwing in the towel, they just hunkered down and continued to get the job done. So bravo.
So what's the perspective from the rest of the panel here as it relates to COVID fatigue? I mean, are you seeing, is this just a new normal now where we've made the adjustments and we've understood how to work this out and we've got the relationships going and things and the lines of communication are open and will continue to be? Are there issues here? This summit, you talked about better opportunities ahead, but what's your own perspective on that?
Yeah, I think, look, you can't run a marathon at the sprint speed all through 23.6 miles, right? So we really, as Peter said very well, that FDA and other regulatory agencies have done a wonderful job. They got out of the gates with the highest speed possible while keeping an eye on the quality on most things. Certainly there have been some missteps, as Peter already spoke about. We need to not think about that, but how we can learn the lessons from there as we go forward. I think if we look at just clinicaltrials.gov, in the first, let's say 3 months, the number of clinical trials targeted towards COVID-19 patients versus the next 1.5 months, more than 10 times the number of trials. I don't think we can expect the agency or anybody to be able to continue to open the INDs at the same speed which they did in the first month. Within 24 hours, IND approvals were being granted, which have now obviously delayed and shifted. I think second thing that happens is initially everything was being related to, let's say, COVID-19 targeting was going into one division, but obviously with approved therapies, INDs are now falling into various divisions, but I don't think there is yet a consensus in terms of standardization of those reviews. So the feedbacks being provided for the various INDs of the same class of drugs may differ. And so those are opportunities to learn as we go forward. I think we also, as sponsors of many of these things, have to become smarter in terms of what we are doing rather than always only putting on one thing on top of the other, but rather analyzing what are the top questions we really need answers for, what is it that we need the input for. I think one of the questions that have already come up in the chat box also is related to CMC and inspections. I think agency has provided guidance. Number one, if we have already inspected a plant, we are more open to then review the drug application and depending on what the findings were from the past for those plants, for the manufacturing organizations, we can look at approving the drug without necessarily having to re-inspect the sites. They've also provided guidance where, where we cannot travel, then we'll have to discuss how we do forward. So one of the things that I think agency can provide further guidance as to what their thought process is in terms of using the same virtual ways of inspection that they're doing for GCP compliance and GCP quality assurance. So can those same principles be applied here or not? How do they utilize local offices that they do have spread out around the country to be able to do those inspections as well. I think those are the things that now we have to start thinking about and talking to the agency so that we can continue the speed of development, as I said, beyond the COVID therapies, other treatments that are required by the patients as well.
You know, let me just, I mean, Sam, you raise a really crucial point, which is the COVID experience, I think, has empowered people inside FDA who want to embrace and communicate change over a whole variety of FDA issues, not the least of which is clinical trial design and inspection issues. So I think that the people inside the agency that want to change, that are change agents, have been empowered through COVID-19.
So Jeremy, traditionally when you talk about change agents at the FDA, you're talking about oncology, right? Because that was the area that several years ago, Richard Pazdur embraced the breakthrough therapy designation. He went after a lot of different things. They opened up the doors and they have sped up significantly the rate at which you can do a cancer drugs program. So what do you see here as it relates to what's going on, those opportunities? Is this more of a disease designation where you're seeing the fastest action? I mean, are you seeing, there's not just one FDA, as many people will tell you, there are a variety of FDAs. Is everybody performing at the same level?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great question, and maybe just a 20-second comment about the previous question, John. I think, you know, when we think about COVID fatigue, there's also the fatigue on us as individuals, and I think, you know, we talk about companies and the FDA. You know, it's been a tough year, and I think it's been a tough year for people in all walks of life, and so I think it's that's just reality. You know, working from home, which pretty much my organization has been doing since March, that's tough. You know, I think I'm sure most people on the folks and the WebEx today are in the same boat. So I don't think we should underestimate at the personal level the impact of COVID. I think to the second question that you asked, which is an excellent question. If I think about putting this into big kind of buckets, and Smith and Peter touched on this, there are changes which require extra resources, right? So we can double FDA resources, and they can process twice as many reviews in the same period of time, or we can double resources in the industry, but do things the same way, right? And we could still decide that for key, you know, diseases, that's an important investment to make, right? It's important, even if we can't do it quicker through process, we put more resources or money on it. That's one big bucket. But I think the second big bucket, which is the one we're far more interested in, is can we do things differently and smarter, right? And I think some of those, I mean, maybe therapeutically related, John, but I think what COVID has shown me, and I think many folks I've spoken to, is that if you take things like virtual trials, you take direct shipment of patients to a drug to patients, much of this is a mindset. Much of this is we decide we want to do things quickly. We want to be far more aggressive with virtual trials. We want to do more master protocols. And so I think this opportunity, yes, I agree that, you know, that obviously Rick and the oncology division have done an amazing job. I think this can go across all of FDA, and it can go globally beyond FDA to PMDA and EMA as well.
So Lisa, let's get your feedback here in terms of opportunities, the way the FDA has responded. I'm curious if you could wave a magic wand and just like change things at the FDA so that they would be more attuned the way you'd like them to be, perhaps a lesson in terms of what you've learned during the pandemic, what would that be?
I think I'd like to just build on Jeremy's point in answering that question for you, John. I've been reflecting on all the conversation, and I think some of the barriers that we've experienced as an industry actually we pose upon ourselves. So we talked about direct-to-patient trials, virtual trials, direct-to-patient shipments as an example. Much of our concern has been the magic we can't do that without really understanding why we couldn't do that. The technology exists. The regulations don't strictly stop us in many cases, and a lot of it is a fear of prudent risk-taking on our behalf. But when we're faced with a pandemic, we must be willing to take that risk in order to ensure patient safety and in order to ensure that we can continue to drive access of patients to our medicines. So I think the FDA has sort of the same challenge that we do. It's easier to say no, or let's take it step by step until you can't afford to any longer. So if I was to look at it, I wish we would just change our mutual mindsets as to say, what can we suspend as being truth when it's really more myth, and break through those invisible barriers we put ahead of ourselves because we're a little bit afraid. I think we've probably shown within the agency, without the agency, that we could be a little bit more bold when the technology exists, there's no other barriers, and we're really trying to be much more effective and efficient in driving forward drug development for patients. So it's if anything, it's a mindset change.
So Roy, there was the initial response which required the FDA to facilitate, right? I think in terms of being able to continue to do things, change things up, do different delivery of medications, virtual trial sites, and so forth. And then I'm curious whether there's going to be a push here as well as a pull. Is there something that you'd like to see change here in terms of how this could be further facilitated, or how it could adapt better to this current situation, and as it may apply to future R&D endeavors, whether there's some sort of a continuation here that's likely to continue to influence your group?
Well, I must say, as I indicated, the FDA's flexibility and pragmatism, I think, has been palpable. And to my mind, this is really a continuation of prior behaviors. I mean, obviously, you've commented on the Oncology Review Division. As a company which has a very broad therapeutic footprint, I would honestly say we've seen the same responsiveness from other review divisions, and we've not had any delays of reviews or anything like that. So I think the pragmatism and the flexibility has been great. I also am really very encouraged by the fact that the agency is not dropping standards. I think the agency is saying that you still have to demonstrate safety and efficacy. The hurdles are the same. And I think that's really important. I think it would be a real tragedy if this type of crisis was used to, in some way, lower standards. And I see no evidence of that. I see the agency being as committed as ever to really being wanting to define benefit risk in a rigorous and fulsome way. I really don't want to see that change. I also don't want to see the evidentiary hurdles lowered in any way. So I must say I'm extremely impressed with how the agencies have responded, their flexibility, their pragmatism, but at the same time, the commitment to quality and standards.
I think to Lisa and Roy's point, industry is putting its money where FDA's mouth is. FDA is saying we need to do things more pragmatically while keeping quality standards at a premium. And industry is saying, okay, let's do that, because in the past, industry has looked at initiatives from FDA and said, well, maybe that's interesting, but maybe we're not quite ready to do that yet. And now, because of the circumstances, industry is really stepping up to the plate.
So, Peter, I'm curious. I mean, obviously, the pandemic had a big impact on everybody in the industry and the FDA as well. Does the FDA come out of this permanently changed in any fashion, or is there just a reversion back to pre-pandemic standards and expectations on the regulatory side?
Well, I think, post-COVID, we're at a crossroads, and one exit leads backwards. Let's go back to the old safe way. We don't want the FDA to be issuing EUAs. They were cowboys. And the other way leads to understanding the lessons learned and incorporating that into how the agency does business. Just around Thanksgiving of last year, seems like 20 years ago, the FDA reorganized the Office of New Drugs with the intent of bringing new scientific capabilities to bear and new technologies to bear. They created the Office of New Drug Policy to help divisions understand how to incorporate new regulatory science, because industry told the FDA that when they went in with new methodologies, they got the 10,000-yard death stare from reviewers. So I think that the COVID experience should empower new ways of thinking. But again, we live in the real world, and there's the potential of, when you stretch the elastic, of having it snap back and go in the wrong direction. So I'm optimistic, but I'm not entirely sure that's going to happen on its own. We have to continue to reward innovation on both on the agency side and on the developer side, and that also means explaining to politicians what that means.
So, Samit, what do you think are the key opportunities here? I mean, what would you like to see come out of this? Because eventually the pandemic will end. The virus will be conquered in some fashion or another, one hopes, maybe sooner or later, depends. But I mean, what do you want to see of all the different changes that you've made here? What are the things you want to keep? And what are the things that are most likely to stay altered after the pandemic is over?
I think we have to wait to see what will stay, but here are the two buckets I could put into in terms of my dream of the future, so to say. So from a regulatory perspective, and I'm not a regulatory department person, Lisa, apologize for if I misspeak anything, please correct me. But I think there is an opportunity here for the future from the agency's perspective, and I'm not talking just about the FDA, but also EMA, PMDA, and other regulatory agencies, that there is a door open. We have come such a long way from a technology perspective. Can we really move towards, let's say, cloud-based submissions or digital submissions only without the desk copies? We're killing a lot of trees and we're still submitting paper copies of nth numbers. Are they really, really required? Can we move towards real-time reviews of submissions as well, as we have already spoken about? So that's from the regulatory perspective. I think where we need more of a cohesion between industry and academia and regulatory agencies, I think that could fall under the bucket of how we work towards telemedicine and remote study visits for patients so that it becomes easier. Ways of data collection from sites beyond the primary site where the patient is seen. So whether be conducting local labs or imaging, not at the central site, but at the local site and being able to read them remotely. If we think about electronic informed consents, can we do that? That will allow us to enroll patients in a decentralized fashion and be able to conduct clinical research. Can we think about study drug supply? As Lisa, I think, had mentioned it earlier, that it's our mindset. If we can evolve, I think the agency is going to be very helpful in terms of thinking that through. How about data management in terms of how we collect data, how we review data, or how we monitor data? So just a small point on that. For example, electronic medical records have become commonplace, but there are only 3 countries in the world that by legislation allow electronic medical record review for source data verification. Can we do better than that? And even within that, even in the United States where it is allowed, not all sites are capable or allow that to happen. So I think there is a lot of work that we can do to really learn from the lessons from COVID pandemic and then carry them forward to accelerate drug development and maybe even do it in a better way than we've been doing thus far.
Jeremy, how about you? What's your take on this?
Well, I mean, Samit just actually gave a pretty impressive and quite, just an excellent answer. So I think, not looking to duplicate all his excellent points. I would just throw in just a couple of different points. First off, we can't go back. I mean, that's a non-starter. I agree with Peter. The crossroads is how quickly we move forward. So we clearly are going to move forward. The question is how quickly. And I think a lot of it, and it seems as though the panelists, we all agree, is a mindset. It's less technology. Although I do believe that if everybody gets onto the virtual trials and if everybody jumps immediately on the technology solution, that will certainly present some technology barriers to the technology companies. I think we're all, that's always kind of a worry. So, but I think, just a couple of other things that I'd like to pick up, which we haven't touched on before, is there has been, and the focus is much on the FDA, there has been incredible collaboration across the industry. I mean, it's just been unbelievable how well, different companies have come together, whether it's master protocols, which, we've really not done that much in the past. Now we're all talking about master protocols and there's numerous examples of platform trials. Industry is getting together and sharing information. We're picking up the phone, we're calling each other, going back to Ron's point. What are you going to do? This was back in March. I would call my colleagues, what are you doing in this situation? What decisions are you making? And we were very freely and openly sharing information for the benefit of everybody. And it's not that didn't happen in the past. It just didn't happen as often. And now it's just happening in a consolidated, consorted way. So I think that needs to continue. It needs to continue on a global basis. It can't just be FDA focused. Beyond that, I think, as I say, Smith's covered a lot of the specifics I would highlight.
I'm kind of curious, Lisa. I mean, it has struck me that there are some things that the FDA would probably like to get back to, like on-site inspections of manufacturing and things like that. Maybe some uncomfortable, and for good reason, some uncomfortable reactions in terms of remotely monitoring or inspecting some of the facilities and things like that. That there are certain vulnerabilities that the industry may be exposed to here because of that. I'm curious, I mean, do you see some of this coming back? I mean, some of these things, what aspects of on the regulatory side do you think are going to most quickly revert back to a pre-pandemic status?
I think there's a couple of points to make there. So you're right. I think there will be some bits where we will need to go back to some semblance of the previous way of doing things. You can't fully replace site inspections with virtual inspections when you're looking at a manufacturing plant. Although you can go pretty far to doing, to user mutual reliance. You could use previous inspections as a guide. We could be much more streamlined. I think what will make us go back if we can't provide data and information to show that the changes that we implemented didn't resulted in a decrease in quality or safety to the patients. So if we're able to show and prove that all the changes we had to implement in a COVID world didn't cause challenges with the ability to interpret data, didn't cause missed surveillance of patient safety, didn't cause decreased quality of our manufacturing, and if we could show that that didn't happen, I think we're going to be much less likely to go backwards. If we can't do that, then I think people will be more inclined to revert to the old way of doing things. But I think as an industry, we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to how we modernize drug development to look at what we've done and generate the data to show that we can implement new ways of working going forward.
I just jump out. So it's something that Jeremy said that's worth really focusing on. Remember, a year ago, master protocols was not a gimme. Now, everybody entirely buys into it, and that is a game changer.
Everybody's nodding their heads. You hit a nerve there. Well, tell me about that. I mean, why is that important?
Well, drugs today are far more complicated. They do many more interesting things. They're more expensive to develop and certainly to manufacture. When you rethink the clinical trial paradigm on a master protocol basis, and all of a sudden you're looking at not just one teeny weeny little indication to get a drug on the market, but all sorts of data that's being collected, and it's all important and it's all relevant and it's all justifiable inside the agency. All of a sudden you're looking at one product across a huge spectrum of patient needs. So ultimately, while master protocols have a direct kind of clinical trial design discussion, the benefits to patients are just enormous. It completely changes the paradigm of how medical products help patients.
So, Roy, everybody here on the panel is, ex-FDA, but also the companies are significant in size with significant resources for R&D and regulatory issues and so on. I do wonder if there's a different perspective here sometimes between the big pharma or the large company perspective and the biotech with one or two products in the clinic where they're working with regulators and working through this whole process. I think that, a lot of them shut down their labs initially, then they've been ramping up their lab work again and getting things back going again. And maybe some uncertainty here as it relates to how a smaller company with fewer resources do this. Do you think that there's any aspect of this that plays either in the favor or against the favor of the smaller companies, Roy?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I must say the one area that I will tell you during this pandemic that I've been most pleased to be at a very large company and where we have a lot of control over what we do is pretty much you're the architect of your destiny. So in other words, you're not at the whim of a CRO shutting down in a region or doing a blanket pause or interrupting trial activities, because the restart is obviously difficult. And not only is it difficult, the loss of continuity can be pretty significant. So I do think through this, companies that have invested in scale and that have invested in control are quite well positioned. I think if you have soup to nuts control over design, startup, execution, monitoring, data management, data analysis, reporting, you're in a very different place from if you are handing these things off to various vendors who may be variably functional. So, to my mind, scale has been really our friend here, and certainly a high degree of control has been our friend. I do talk with a lot of my colleagues in smaller companies, and this has been actually quite difficult. I think, particularly where without having a lot of control, you've been at the whim of, blanket decisions by other entities. That has been quite difficult to manage through. So that would be my quick take on that.
Okay, Samit, obviously Bristol Myers also has a lot of relationships with smaller companies that you're working with. And from that perspective, I mean, what's the feedback you're getting from the other companies that you work with?
I think the overall takeaway is if you keep the patient at the center of what you need to do, then you have to make decisions based on that perspective. For life-threatening disease, now if you think about what has happened in terms of the recovery, there's a lot of data that has now come that the areas that have recovered the fastest or are on their fastest pace of recovery, nothing has recovered 100%. But if you look at hematology, oncology, and cardiovascular diseases, these are the clinical trials, these are the patients who are coming back to the clinic to be seen by the physicians in the hospital at the fastest pace. Places where we don't see as high of a recovery is immunology, gastroenterology, and those conditions. So I think we have to keep in mind, not all companies, not all industries are working in the same pace, in the same field. So everybody has a different experience on this. But I think the ultimate goal, if we keep, again, the patient at the center of it, we'll make good decisions. And that's what I think what is being heard from Jeremy, from Roy, from others, and Lisa as well, that ultimately the goal is the same, the purpose is the same. How we get to it, large companies, small companies, we are taking different routes. Some labs did shut down, but I think they're back into doing the discovery work. Similarly, drugs. I think one thing that didn't shut down, at least I didn't hear much, is manufacturing. Why? Because everybody wanted to make sure that the patients are not being shortchanged in terms of getting the drug that they really, really need. So if we can do it for manufacturing, I think we have to just be mindful of how we do it for the other parts of the industry.
Jeremy, you didn't work at a small company when you were at Shire, but it was smaller than Takeda is right now. So I would like to I value your feedback on that point as well.
Sure, thanks, Sean. And actually, I have spent 6 years in a small private biotech in a past life, so I can, and I'm based in Boston. So actually being based in Boston, we're absolutely surrounded by small companies. And I think Sumit summarized it nicely. It depends on a therapeutic area. So some of my colleagues in certain therapeutic areas, the studies stopped, right? Even if the company said, we're going to leave the study open, they just weren't seeing patients. Either the patients weren't coming in or the sites just weren't able to see patients. And if you're in a small biotech with 1 or 2 assets and they go on pause for 3 or 4 months, that's very scary, because at the time, I think those companies had no idea how quickly they would come back. So I certainly think, to Roy's point, if you're in a bigger organization with multiple assets, even if some do go on pause on a temporary basis, you have many, many others to focus on. And one of those, just quick, Roy's made some excellent points about, Merck's control. Takeda, we have a slightly different model. And I do want to give a big shout out to our CRO partners. They've absolutely not missed a beat in any of this time. They provided us with amazing information on the clinical studies. We've restarted any studies we chose to put on pause incredibly quickly. We've got information at our fingertips, and they've just done an outstanding job. So I just wanted to, again, respect Roy's points 100%, but just give a different experience from the Takeda side.
And that is a major issue for the smaller companies as well, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the outsourcing aspect of drug development for a small company is built, it's baked in
Yeah.
to being a biotech. If you're not getting the kind of service that you need from a CRO or something like that, you really are in trouble. Not to say that that doesn't necessarily happen from time to time. It certainly does. So in terms of looking forward again, I mean, is there anything in particular about how this could play out? Any other aspects towards, you know, the other things that you want to see going forward, Roy, that we haven't touched on?
No, I think to me this has brought home the criticality of having really well-developed business continuity plans, and indeed the ability to be flexible, recognizing, you know, as they always say, your battle plan doesn't usually survive the first encounter with the enemy. So being able to adapt in real time and, you know, work within a flexible framework has been really important. I do think the other comment just to make, and this is a little bit tactical, but I do think that the experience here will push the industry ever increasingly toward central monitoring, remote monitoring, as well as very much more risk-based monitoring. The idea that you have to source document verify 100% of information, I don't think that we're going to be going back to that. And so I do think that at a tactical level, there will be some spin-offs here that I think will be very helpful going forward.
Interesting. Anybody else want to pitch in here? Lisa? Anything else?
I'll take it in a slightly different direction. I think the other thing the crisis has shown, I think in confluence with just some of the conversations that are happening in the US these days, is just the importance of highlighting how important it is to get all our medicines to the population that actually is impacted by the disease. So I think we're all seeing a well-needed refocus on ensuring we have appropriate diversity in our clinical trials. So I think that's going to be another enduring impact in the crisis. You know, at Janssen, we've been focusing on how to improve diversity for a long time. So this is something that we've been committed to, but it's, I think, very, very important that we as an industry, along with the FDA and academics and physicians and patients, we move together to try to improve that aspect of drug development going into the future.
Well, there have been some issues that have been brought up by the whole vaccine development aspect of what's going on right now that's likely to have a spillover effect into other aspects of R&D, diversity being one of them. I mean, a lot of companies are really being required to review and reconsider the way that they, you know, make sure that they have a diverse population of patients in their studies. So, Samit, I mean, from your own perspective, I mean, is this something you're likely to review again, and are there other things like diversity that are going to be front and center because of this?
Well, we already did make the announcement just a couple of weeks ago in terms of our focus on diversity in clinical trials, as well as diversity in general, in terms of even committing to helping train junior faculty as well as fellows from the underrepresented community as well. So we've made that commitment. We are working on it towards increasing the enrollment of diverse population in our clinical trials. We've committed to opening at least 25% of the sites for new studies starting in 2021 to have the sites placed in areas where the larger number of underrepresented populations, such as Blacks and Latinx population, lives. So we are looking forward to working with those sites and enrolling these patients. Now, coming back to your previous question as well, just one more point as to what additional thing that we should be thinking of. I do believe that we have come to a place where there's a lot of data being collected and a lot of clinical trials, and they're being mined in a very, very good way by many companies. There are well-defined cohorts where we have collected information of the approved therapies where we don't necessarily have to keep repeating the same experiment again and again and again. So I think there is value to think about hybrid trials and control arms that are synthetic control arms. We may not use them immediately for purposes of registration, but it is important to start understanding, validating those trial designs and bringing those forwards to decrease the number of patients being exposed to not so effective therapies as the next therapy might be, or to decrease the clinical trial costs, or to accelerate the overall drug development. I think we really need to start thinking on that more and more and more proactively.
Interesting. Okay. So I did want to get to a couple of questions. Before I do that, though, Peter, I wanted to get Peter's impression on this from the kind of an insider perspective at the FDA. Are there aspects of this that are changing the FDA? Do you think that where the FDA is going to make certain things going to increase the importance as it relates to diversity and other aspects of doing R&D? Are there lessons that the regulators are learning here that they're likely to apply in future trials?
Well, the short answer is yes. You know, Mike Tyson said that everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And I think that, you know, for lots of reasons, the issue of diversity in clinical trials is just long overdue. And part of it is, you know, the status quo being a harsh mistress. You know, 10 years ago, we didn't worry about it because the rote answer was, we're all the same biologically, what's the problem? Then came genomics, and we understand that there are significant differences, and we can measure those differences, and they're important in therapeutic outcomes. And I think, again, this empowers the people inside the agency that recognize that they have to do things differently in order to survive. And I think what's also interesting is this is all happening at a time when we're entering into PDUFA negotiations. And I think that, you know, industry and FDA now, you know, have a very strong position, not just to ask for more money, but to ask for more money to do a lot of very important new things.
Absolutely. I want to get to a couple questions before we wrap up today. And I've got somebody that's watching us that really wants an answer to this question. Has FDA or EMA provided companies feedback on how missing dose data might be handled? Anybody want to field that? Samit, you're nodding your head.
Well, look, I think there are two aspects of it. Number one, most companies, if not all, already have statistical analysis plans that are written along with the studies or protocols that acknowledge that there will be missing data. So when we do the analytical plans, we already plan for that. Now, during the COVID-19 situation, one had to think right up front, the magnitude could be larger. So how do you accommodate that? And how do you accommodate the biases that might be occurring during the conduct of the study? In fact, BMS has authored a paper that was reviewed by the FDA as well and is now published in terms of how to plan for analysis and how to plan for those missing data during the analysis. And certainly it's available for anybody to read, but FDA has also provided guidance how to analyze the data with that. The primary and secondary analysis, the good news is most companies that have reported data, I don't think they have been impacted. I don't think, as Roy already said in the beginning, that we, along with Roy, as he said, we've not missed a date for data readouts, for filings, for approvals, et cetera, because the planning right from the beginning, having the mindset that there will be missing data will be there. And so it's not a novelty, so to say. It's a magnitude that could have occurred. The good news, recent report had come out. We've not actually missed a lot of data. We're at the lower end of whatever the missing data in the industry is.
Okay.
An important point there too is that, you know, the agency has been inconsistent in its advice, and that's appropriate because it needs to look at missing dose data on a case-by-case basis. So people calling for guidance on this don't really understand the dynamics of what's going on.
Okay, so Samit, I think I've got a few different cell gene investors that are in here asking about the lysocell application, maybe without addressing any particular drug or new drug application. How have they been in terms of particularly critical communications related to the timing of some of these applications?
Again, keeping it within the constraints of the question that you asked, drugs that have been granted breakthrough therapy designation, the agency in general, and it's not about oncology, it's about anybody with a drug which has a high transformative potential, which has a breakthrough therapy designation, FDA always provides more chances for that dialogue. And we've had our chances as well. So we have a continuous dialogue with the FDA. And FDA has provided us the good guidance, and we continue to work. Our PDUFA date, everybody knows, is in November, so we'll just keep on that.
Yeah, there are a few different deadlines that are being very closely watched right now.
I wonder why.
I wonder why. Okay, last question. RTOR, R-T-O-R was mentioned. Do you anticipate, as a result of the pandemic and Commissioner Hahn's statements on building on the COVID accelerations, that other divisions will be implementing similar pilots, or for that matter, go from pilot to fully fledged pathway to approval? Anybody want to pick up on that, Peter?
I think the answer is yes. I think it's, again, it depends on how potent the partnership between agency and industry is. There needs to be a great degree of trust for that to happen. I think people inside the FDA want it to happen. So again, I'm optimistic.
Okay, well, that's great. And on that optimistic note, I'd like to thank everybody for participating in today's panel. It's been a great conversation. Huge issue, like I said, that involves so many different, everyone in the industry, and obviously a lot of people outside of the industry as well. So I appreciate you getting involved today and being on our panel. Also want to thank Alok for coming back as a sponsor for today's conversation. I know we've got another one coming up later in the year, and we'd hope that everybody in the audience will come back for our future presentations as well. Thanks again. We'll see you in the future.
Thank you, John.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, John.
Bye.